Welcome to APCUG's Wednesday workshop, where we get together in the middle of the week and we learn more about technology. As it is the third Wednesday of the month, this is our traditional Learning Linux. And we have a number of interesting topics today. We hope you will enjoy, and maybe later on you will take part in sharing some stuff with us in the future. We're going to start today with our question of the month, and we've got Cal Esneault going to be dealing with that. And we've talked about desktop environments before, and we mentioned that Ubuntu has just now come out with an official the Cinnamon one, right? That's what we're doing. And the question was, well, what's the difference? You know, if it's cinnamon, you know, what's the difference? So Cal has volunteered to answer that question. So we'll turn things over to Cal and learn about the differences.
Okay, one of the questions I always get is, what is a Linux distribution and how do I choose a distribution? And one way to do it is to show an example and compare two different distributions having the same interface. So today I'm going to look at Ubuntu Cinnamon and Linux Mint Cinnamon. So Cinnamon is the desktop and Ubuntu is one distribution and Linux Mint is another distribution. So when you go to choose and set up a Linux system, the first choice, generally most people, is the Linux desktop. That's the graphical user interface. And some of them are GNOME, KDE, Mate, XFCE, and those we've covered this year, and Cinnamon I covered last year. So John will come up with XFCE today. And the second question is, where do you download your code? And there's several places to go. There's the Ubuntu family, the Linux Mint group, and Fedora. And if you consider all the options you have, for instance, here I have a grid where the columns, each column would be a different distribution A, B, C, and the rows would be a different desktop 1, 2, 3. And as Arvo would point out, you can fill in the rest of the squares if you're experienced enough and want to make the effort. But generally, the ones I've shown here are publicly available. So you can just go download them off the internet and get the ISO. And to compare a distribution, or when we pick a distribution, the desktop, we generally pick by feel, by the way it looks, how familiar we are. And that's pretty straightforward. Picking a distribution is a little more complicated because you have to work with it a while. And do you trust it? How is its support? What are its goals? Do they match your goals? And one thing, if you have a distribution and already set up and you want to compare and find another distribution, just check it out with the same interface. So that's what I'm going to do today. And if you look at Ubuntu, is a very popular Linux, and it's for desktops, servers, and devices, like the Internet of Things. It relies heavily on GNOME and Debian as a base, and it's distributed by a company called Canonical. And there are different desktop versions that you can get with Ubuntu. Ubuntu with GNOME, and Kubuntu with KDE, Ubuntu with XFCE, and more. Linux Mint focuses mainly on desktops. And it has a GNOME and Debian base, but it also relies also on the Ubuntu base. And it's distributed by a group in called the Mint team over in Europe. And it developed about 12 years ago its own desktop called Cinnamon. And the Linux Mint, you can also get XFCE and Mate versions. And as John pointed out, recently, Ubuntu made Ubuntu Cinnamon an official flavor. So it's part of their team. And I want to compare specifically Ubuntu Cinnamon 2304 and Linux Mint Cinnamon 21.1. So a typical distribution, when they build a distribution, there's kind of a core or bottom part, which is has to work in order to run your machine. And it's got the Linux kernel as the heart of it. And then closely configured, it has things like package managers, install code, all this under the hood stuff that we never look at. But each distribution, once it has a working system, since we have open software, they can add a desktop interface and any associated helper programs, which are called the desktop environment, and can go out to the thousands of distribution of available software to like do your banking or edit pictures, listen to music and so forth. And they'll pick the ones they want. So if we look at Ubuntu, it has its base, and then it goes out and picks a bunch of default software. And on top of this, for you to interact with it, it adds a desktop environment. So if I consider the base and the default software, they kind of get all of this more or less the same all the time. And if you add different desktops, you'll see that they just put the desktop on top of their base. So there's Ubuntu Cinnamon and XFCE version and the Mate version. Mint also uses the Ubuntu base, but then if you notice, I got the two colors for the default software kind of mixed. They use some of the Ubuntu software choices, but then they make their own choices, and they've created a lot of their own programs to make it user-friendly. And on top of that, they put their own desktop environments. So if we look at Linux Mint and consider their base, their compilation base, then in their same desktops, we have Cinnamon and XFCE and Mate. Now, if you want to compare the two distributions, the easiest way is to use the common desktop so that those physical things don't look too different, and then see what is different to compare one distribution to another. And if you're familiar with XFCE or Mate, you could do the same with those. So here in Ubuntu, they come out and compile a new version every 6 months. But some people don't like to go that often, so there's a long-term support every 2 years, which then will last for 5 years. That's the long term. But if you get on the interim, then you have to update it every 6 months. Linux Mint decided it didn't want to update it that often, so it only uses the long-term support version, and it has little point releases that just update its software. So the two latest versions, 2304 for Ubuntu and Linux Mint 21.1, I'm using today. So here is Cinnamon, Ubuntu Cinnamon. The background is the same background virtually that you'll see if you download a new version, a clean install of almost any of the Ubuntu flavors. This is called Lunar Lobster, is the code name they've chosen. What I want you to notice is this is a single panel type of system, just like Windows. There's no two panels. On the left, we have the program launcher or the start button. And then you have your favorites. And over on the right, you have your basic system icons, date, time, shutdown. And they allow you to have desktop icons, shortcuts if you want. The latest GNOME does not give you that choice as a default. Then here is Linux Mint Cinnamon. Again, it has the one bar, it has its own background, and it has the same shortcuts if you want. You can remove and add these shortcuts as you wish. So back and forth, they have the same approach, although they have slightly different themes. So here are the two I've got, and just to make sure we have the specific details, there is Cinnamon 2304 and Mint 2101. And if you notice, due to the fact that Ubuntu updates more frequently, it has a 6.2 kernel, whereas the Linux Mint has a 5.15. Now they update the security patches and the bug patches, but they will stay 5.15 through the whole 5 years that it's valid. Then you'll notice that there are a bunch of packages, and you'll notice that Ubuntu has Snap. These are the container types, and that Linux Mint has dpackage. And the themes here, or the desktop, is basically the same, 5.6 and 5.7 and 5.6.7, 5.6.5, but the themes are different. Ubuntu has a Yaru theme, and Mint has its own themes that it personally developed. And they're both kind of heavy desktops if you understand how much this is. It's about a gig and a gig and a half. So here is the programs. Hit the launch button, and this is the basic layout of Cinnamon. Your favorites generally don't go on the panel. Generally, this side panel is where you have most of your favorites. And then you have the categories, and as you click at each category, you get the list of applications in that category. Mint is the same thing, slightly different colors, but there's a couple more favorites. There's your categories, and there's the programs that are in that particular category. If you look at where are they different, here is Cinnamon and its accessories, some kind of basic accessories you would expect. Linux Mint has a few more. It's not quite the same as it appears, because in each distribution, sometimes they put these under different categories. The only real difference is that Linux Mint has a image writer. If you want to make a new live USB, it has that available. And then it has Warpinator, which is a way to share files between another Linux machine or a Windows machine without having to set up a fancy network. Just use your Wi-Fi. In graphics, Ubuntu has a couple graphic programs, and if I go to Mint, it doesn't have those programs. So Ubuntu added a couple extra that it liked. Linux Mint didn't choose that. If we go down to sound and video, we have one to watch videos and one to listen to music. Those two appear again. This is an install, because this is a live USB that I used for Linux Mint. And then it has something to watch internet TV, which is basically Pluto. If we go down to administration, here is the basic software updaters and software managers, store, if you will. And Mint, it looks like they have a lot more, but this, for the most part, the only two that are different are the system reports, which is something Mint has added, and time shift, which is a backup method that Mint has added. In fact, time shift is a program that Mint is responsible for now. Now, if you look through this menu and said, okay, what's different and what's the same, you notice that the menu name is not always the name of the program, but here we see the files program are the same, Nemo. The viewer, the video viewer is the same, Celluloid. The music program is the same, Rhythmbox. For text editor and PDF, these two are classic GNOME programs. Mint has just borrowed these and made slight additions. So they're really the same program with a slightly different viewer. Things that are different, the backup, Ubuntu uses a kind of a third-party Deja Dupe. Mint has its own backup. Software manager, Ubuntu, they didn't make a new one. They just went and used the GNOME software that everybody who uses GNOME has. Mint went and modified and has its own software store. Software updater, Ubuntu has a software manager that it does for all of its flavors, and Mint has its own update manager. And there are other things, even though they look the same, they may have different names, and but they basically do the same functions. So in general, most of the software is comparable as far as complexity. The Ubuntu file manager, this is to show you, and here's the Mint. And what I'm trying to show you here is that really these are the effects of the theme. Notice this is kind of a gray and a red, and this is yellow, and these have a little stripe on them. But if you look at the icons and the way the sidebar panels, they're very close. So it's 90% the same. It's just a little appearance. Cinnamon for system settings, instead of having a classic kind of text that rolls down, it sets it up in these nice little pretty icons. Here is Ubuntu, and then here is Linux Mint, and they're almost exactly the same. If you look at, for instance, these applets and date and time and desklets, if I go back up, you notice applets, date and time, desklet, and notice that the icons change, but they use a different icon set, but it's all the same basic programs because this is part of the Cinnamon desktop. Themes, if you want, that's how you set the appearance of any Linux system. Here is Cinnamon, Ubuntu Cinnamon, and it has only one type of pointer. It has a few different types of color changes you can make for the application bars. And Linux Mint, Cinnamon, since this is their desktop, they have more modifications. You can pick a lot of different pointers, and they have a lot more themes and choices, and they have their own Mint Y, Mint X that you can pick. The backgrounds, because the backgrounds come from the basic Ubuntu Lunar Lobster. And there's some other backgrounds you can get. This was the original Cinnamon for Ubuntu. It's got some pictures and a lot of modern art type choices. Linux Mint, it has its own personal background that it has for all of its flavors. And it has probably a lot more scenic pictures. And you can pick the current version 21.1 or the 21.0, all those pictures also. And on both of them, you can put your own photo. So that's practically, greater than 90% the same look and feel. Another thing is a Cinnamon has, and this is applets. So both of this is a Cinnamon function, they'll be pretty much the same on both. You just right click on an empty part of your panel and you'll get this whole list. Now, essentially, this is the way that these desktops configure, and this is the get their different features. In GNOME, we would call these extensions or add-ons. They're little programs that go and change the GNOME environment, which is the base under Cinnamon. And one thing you have to add on to both Ubuntu Cinnamon and Linux Mint Cinnamon, if you want to see the workspaces are kind of built into GNOME. They just show up automatically. In Cinnamon, you have to add them. So here I've added them, and you can see I have 4 virtual workspaces down here. And if I switch to see them all, they'll go out in a linear row. Whereas in GNOME, this shows up almost automatically. In Linux Mint, you see I have 4 here. And when you want to see all the desktops for selection, they make a square, pretty close. One thing that is different is the software stores. Ubuntu Cinnamon just uses GNOME. This is the same thing you'd see if you used regular Ubuntu. So if you go and pick a particular app, here I'll pick Critter, which you'll see, and you have various choices, and one of them is Deb because it's a Debian-based system. But if you want a container, it'll also give you a choice for a snap container. And if I go into the terminal and I can see, Snap has its own system. I'll do a snap list and I can see all the snap programs that I have. But if I go to Flatpak, which is another container, it is now installed. If I go to Cinnamon, I'll see a similar array, but this is a different manager. It also enables me to pick Flatpak's containers specifically. If I go and look for the same Critter, what I will find is that it'll give me a system package, which is a Debian, or it'll give me a choice for a Flatpak container. And again, if I go to the terminal in this system, I do a Flatpak list, it'll show me the Flatpaks. And if I look for snaps, it'll tell me that snap is not installed. So basic observations, Ubuntu Cinnamon has the same look and feel of Linux Mint Cinnamon. You'll quickly adapt if you've used one or the other. However, the support periods are different. Ubuntu 2304 has 9-month support and uses a 6.2 kernel. At the end of that, you just hit a button and it has a nice auto update path and it'll take you to 2310, I believe is the next one. Mint, it will stay with the LTS until 2027. and it will keep that kernel until 2027. And they have a nice button if you want to go to 21.1 to 21.2, you just push the button and it'll do it real quickly. The software defaults, the choices that both systems make is different. Both use Debian packages. And what you'll find is that the Ubuntu, the Debian packages, if someone, they will be updated since March of this year or April of this year. And if you go to Mint, you'll find that they have not been updated since April of 2022, 1 year old. So that's the choice you make if you want to have all the latest versions. Ubuntu has it, but Mint, you would have to do that separately, which you can do. There are different themes, and I showed you the different icon types, different colors, different pointers, different backgrounds. All of these are parts of the theme. Ubuntu uses a Yaru theme, and Mint has its own set. And they promote different containers. Ubuntu is the originator of Snap and has the Snap store. So it makes Snap its default, and it frowns on having Flatpak installed. Mint uses Flatpak as the default. It is well integrated, and it frowns on Snap being installed. Although you can install either in both systems. So some final thoughts is that as you go through desktops and look at them, generally speaking in Linux, you'll like the look and feel or you won't like the look and feel. You can decide that pretty quickly just by picking an ISO on a USB stick and going through it. But distributions are more fundamental. They have longer term issues. And my advice is if you're going to decide or consider another distribution, you need to test it for at least a month or more. So it goes through updates and the problems you have and your equipment. And so that's a longer term decision. And if you have any questions, I guess we'll take them at this time.
Yeah, I think it's pretty interesting. It's the same, but not the same. And, you know, each of them would probably say, well, we're not exactly the same. Ours is better. And the other one would say, ours is better.
I do not have any questions. I thought that was absolutely and completely, totally clear.
Yeah.
So Kevin, you're on.
Yes, just one quick thing, Cal. A fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed it as a fledgling kind of Linux guy, just poking around here and there. I really enjoyed it. Would you be so kind as to put up that last slide? I like to take a picture of some of the slides, and that was such a good synopsis of what to look for as how I should test my desktop, and I mean the distro versus desktop. And I would just really like to get a snapshot of that. If you could put that up again, please. Well, I guess it's the one just before that.
Yeah, hold on.
Yeah, this is the one. Well,
That one?
yeah, that's it. Perfect. Thank you. Could you make that full screen, please? Thank you very much. I got it.
And all of you can do a print screen and capture that if you're on a Linux machine. If you're on a Windows machine, Judy taught us that it's the window print screen, and it just saves that screen right to your computer.
And I do have a question. What are the pros and cons of waiting to update upgrade the kernel only every 5 years with the LTS choice. Can I decide to switch away from an LTS installation at any time if I want to get the kernel updates more often?
Yes. The downside is that when the distribution is issued, it goes through and double checks any kind of little configuration conflicts. So unless you need to, the security and bug fixes are done. The advantage is if you have a newer piece of equipment, the kernel is what changes to keep up with the equipment. So if you got a new computer or some kind of new printer or something that wasn't covered in that kernel, because the kernel has the drivers for your hardware, then you can update the kernel without updating the rest of the software. So that's why you would do it, is because you got a piece of equipment that didn't work.
And how do you just update the kernel?
In Mint, in most of them, there's in the software updater, there's a particular place where you can select the kernel.
Thank you.
Now, the other thing to go along with that is you don't have to wait 5 years. The long-term support will go 5 years, but both Ubuntu and Mint every 2 years comes out with their next long-term. So there's an overlap. So the Mint 21 is the one that's out now, and next year Mint 22 will come out. It will have a newer kernel than 21. But the idea is that for some businesses and enterprises, they like stability, so they don't want to be switching all the time. So, you know, every 2 years you could update with maybe the newest kernel and go for 2 years, then update, or go crazy like I used to do in the early days with Ubuntu and switch every 6 months and get whatever's the newest that way. Now, I get updates for the Linux headers, which is part of the kernel all the time, but they are not active because in my Mint, that long-term one is still the one that says this is the active one. But I could switch to a newer one. But as Cal said, there might be something in the newer kernel that doesn't, you know, necessarily match and play well with my older computer and the older version of the operating system I'm using. I think the best thing to do is if you don't have a need for some kind of a big change, don't worry about it. That's why I stopped going the 6 months, every 6 months. And I usually do 2 years for me. I could go longer. My way of looking at things is I look at what's the new one got for me. And if I look through it and say, ma'am, that doesn't look, nope. I'll say, forget it. I'll keep it for another 2 years. And then maybe by then, there'll be enough changes that I might want to upgrade to the newest one after 4 years. It's all kind of a personal preference taste.
Gee, I wish I could do that with Windows. Just saying. I think that's it for Cal.
Yeah, that was excellent, Cal.
Oh, outstanding.
I really like the points, and the biggest points you point out were that Mint likes to do things that they like, that gedit and the other program. It's almost the exact same, but they just kind of smooth some edges or something to make it the X, which is their code for all of their finely tuned programs, you know, the XEd and the other ones like that. So that was very good. I will now take this moment to do a public service announcement and say that we're always open for people who have questions about Linux that would like to have them submitted to us, and see if somebody on our team can answer that. And that's what keeps us going is, people who have, questions. We did that a month ago, and this week, without questions, we're going to come here and say, hi, everybody, how's it going? Okay. So if you have questions that you would like to be throwing into the question of the month and get something explained in detail or something, send them to me or send them to Judy. I'm Jay Kennedy at apcug.org, and she's Jay Talur at apcug.org. She'll get it to me, and we'll find one of our team members that can kind of handle that for you. So we need questions. We need topics for what we're supposed to be doing on here.